At my baby shower, I announced we were naming our son Xander, and my single childless cousin Brad stood up and said he'd spiritually reserved that name since 2019. He showed me his phone with a list of 2,000 plus names he'd claimed, started a Facebook group called Justice for Future Baby Names, crashed a family wedding with a PowerPoint about his stolen legacy, and eventually legally changed his own name to Xander so he could call himself Xander Sr. despite having no kids. I was in the middle of my baby shower when I announced my baby was going to be named Xander. Everyone reacted like a normal human being at first. I heard applause, cheers, the works. But then I looked at my cousin Brad, who was eyeing me down like I'd just stolen his credit card and used it for sports betting. Brad stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. "You can't use that name," he declared aloud. "I've reserved it." The room went silent. "Reserved it?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" Brad puffed up his chest like a peacock who'd been taking steroids. "I've had that name spiritually claimed since 2019. Here's the thing though, Brad was single. Brad had been single since his girlfriend dumped him for insulting her mother in front of her. Brad also told everyone routinely how he hated children. How he decided this name was claimed was beyond me. I remember trying to keep things light because there was still cake to eat and presents to open. "Brad, you can still use the name when you have kids. Lots of people share names." "Wrong move." Brad's face got redder. "You're stealing my legacy. You're sabotaging my future fatherhood." He pulled out his phone with the enthusiasm of someone about to show you their NFT collection. "I have it all here. My list of names I'd reserved for the future." I took one look at the phone, and his notes app said, "Sure thing. Here's a comprehensive list," followed by over 2,000 baby names all bullet pointed. I looked back up at him with an extremely agape jaw. My Aunt Marie, who'd spent weeks planning this shower, tried to steer us toward the cake table. Brad whipped around to face her. "Aunt Marie, I need you to witness this theft. This is name fraud." "Name fraud." He said name fraud with a straight face. My grandmother, bless her heart, suggested everyone calm down and remember we were here to celebrate. Brad pointed at her like a prosecutor in a courtroom drama. "You're enabling intellectual property theft, Grandma." That's when Tim had enough. My beautiful patient husband, who usually had the backbone of a chocolate eclair, stood up. "We're naming our son Xander," he said firmly, "and you can shove your imaginary list where the sun doesn't shine." The room gasped. Someone dropped a mimosa. Brad's jaw unhinged like the veteran blow addict he used to be. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Brad announced, already dialing. "He specializes in naming rights." What kind of lawyer specialized in naming rights, I thought to myself. Well, that's when Brad stood up and started pacing around, having an actual phone conversation about emergency name injunctions and establishing first claim rights. He used the phrase conceptual property at least 3 times. 20 minutes later, a guy showed up looking like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward. This was apparently Brad's lawyer friend from law school. The poor guy was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt that said, "I don't want to be here." Brad immediately launched into his presentation, gesturing wildly at me. "She stole the name I've been planning to use for my firstborn son. I need you to explain the legal ramifications." The lawyer friend looked at Brad, then at me and my very pregnant belly, then at the room full of people holding baby shower games and eating tiny sandwiches. His expression shifted from confused to comprehension to something that looked like secondhand embarrassment had gained sentience. "Brad," he said slowly, like he was explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever, "is this seriously why you called me? This is serious legal matter involving intellectual property theft within a family structure," Brad insisted. The lawyer friend pinched the bridge of his nose. "Brad, buddy, let me get this straight. You called me on my only day off this semester. You said it was an emergency. You made me drive 20 minutes across town. For a baby name?" Brad nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. She's stealing my son's identity. You don't have a son, Brad. But I will. You're literally infertile, Brad. You cry about it to me once a month consistently." The room collectively sucked in a breath. Someone whispered, "Oh snap." My uncle started eating popcorn from the snack table like he was watching a movie. The lawyer friend continued, "You can't reserve a name, Brad. That's not how names work. That's not how anything works. Did you seriously think you could legally claim ownership of the name Xander?" Brad opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "And another thing," the lawyer friend was on a roll now. "Even if you could, which you absolutely cannot, what kind of person ruins their pregnant cousin's baby shower over a hypothetical child that doesn't exist?" He turned to me. "Congratulations on your baby. Xander's a great name." Then he looked back at Brad. "Lose my number, and maybe seek therapy." The lawyer friend walked out, leaving Brad standing there like a deflated parade float. Brad looked around the room at everyone staring at him, pointed at me one more time, and announced, "I'll remember this betrayal," before storming out. Little did I know, Brad did mean it, and the next time I saw him, he went on a rampage none of us were ever prepared for. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from various family members. My phone buzzed again as I reached for it, still groggy from pregnancy-induced exhaustion. Aunt Marie's name flashed on the screen. I answered while Tim made breakfast in the kitchen. Aunt Marie launched into a breathless explanation about how Brad had shown up at her house at 6 in the morning with a PowerPoint presentation about the historical significance of the name Xander in our family lineage. She described how he'd brought genealogy charts and everything, trying to prove that great-great-uncle Alexander had gone by Xander, and therefore the name belonged to the male line of succession. Tim walked in with scrambled eggs just as I hung up, his eyebrows raised at my expression. I explained what Aunt Marie had told me, and he shook his head while buttering toast. We ate in relative peace for about 10 minutes before my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. She sounded exasperated as she recounted how Brad had cornered her at the grocery store, following her through the produce section while explaining how I was destroying his future happiness. He'd apparently compared my choice of baby name to stealing someone's wedding dress the night before their ceremony. My mother had abandoned her shopping cart in the cereal aisle just to escape. Over the next few hours, the calls kept coming. My cousin Sarah reported that Brad had created a Facebook group called Justice for Future Baby Names and was inviting all our relatives to join. My uncle called to say Brad had shown up at his workplace during lunch, carrying a petition for family members to sign supporting his claim to the name. Even my grandmother called, bewildered, saying Brad had tried to convince her that she'd promised him the name Xander when he was 12 years old. Tim suggested we go out for the day to clear our heads. We drove to the park, walked the trails, and tried to enjoy the spring weather. I was 7 months pregnant and grateful for the gentle exercise. We stopped at a bench overlooking the pond, and Tim rubbed my swollen feet while we watched ducks paddle by. Our phones stayed mercifully quiet for about an hour. Then Tim started buzzing. His sister was texting frantically. Brad had shown up at her daughter's soccer game, approaching parents on the sidelines to explain how Tim was enabling family betrayal. He'd brought printed screenshots of baby name websites, highlighting how unique and special the name Xander was, trying to demonstrate why it shouldn't be wasted on our child when he had spiritually claimed it first. We decided to head home. As we pulled into our driveway, we noticed Brad's car parked across the street. He was sitting inside, windows down, eating what looked like a gas station sandwich while staring at our house. Tim parked and helped me out of the car. Brad immediately got out of his vehicle and started walking toward us. Tim stepped protectively in front of me as Brad approached. Brad stopped about 10 feet away, holding his hands up in what he probably thought was a peaceful gesture. He started explaining how he'd been doing research all night and had discovered that the name Xander meant defender of mankind, and how this cosmic significance meant it was destined for his future son, not ours. I watched Tim's jaw clench as Brad continued his monologue about destiny and spiritual connections to names. Brad pulled out his phone again, scrolling through what he claimed were astrological charts that proved proved the name Xander would be wasted on a child born in June, rather than his hypothetical future child, who would obviously be born under a more compatible star sign. Tim took my hand, and we walked toward our front door without responding. Brad followed us up the walkway, his voice getting more desperate. He started listing all the ways he'd been preparing for fatherhood, including buying parenting books and watching YouTube videos about child development. He insisted this preparation gave him more right to the name than us, since we'd only been trying for a year, while he'd been spiritually preparing for 5. We made it inside and locked the door. Brad stood on our porch for another 20 minutes, occasionally knocking and calling out statistics about name popularity and how we were ruining his future child's uniqueness. Eventually, we heard his car start and drive away. That evening, we ordered takeout and tried to relax. Tim's phone rang just as our food arrived. His mother sounded upset. Brad had gone to her house and spent 2 hours trying to convince her to talk us out of using the name. He'd brought a binder, she said, filled with printed emails he'd sent to various family members over the years where he'd mentioned wanting to name his future son Xander. Most of these emails were from contexts like, if I ever accidentally have kids, or in the hypothetical situation where I changed my mind about hating children. The next day was Saturday. We'd planned to spend it setting up the nursery, but those plans got derailed when my cousin Emma called. She was hosting a family barbecue that afternoon and warned us that Brad had already RSVP'd and told everyone he had an important announcement to make. She thought we should know in advance. Tim and I debated whether to go. We'd already confirmed our attendance weeks ago, and I didn't want Brad to think he could chase us away from family events. Plus, Emma made amazing potato salad and pregnancy cravings are no joke. We decided to go but agreed to leave if Brad started causing too much drama. We arrived at Emma's house to find most of the family already there. Brad was holding court near the grill, gesturing dramatically while our uncle flipped burgers with the expression of someone reconsidering all their life choices. As soon as Brad spotted us, he abandoned his audience and made a beeline in our direction. Before he could reach us, Emma intercepted him with a plate of appetizers and steered him toward the picnic tables. She shot us an apologetic look over her shoulder. We mingled with other relatives, everyone carefully avoiding the subject of baby names. My Aunt Patricia pulled me aside to whisper that Brad had called her at midnight, asking if she'd be willing to testify as a character witness about his fitness for future fatherhood. The barbecue proceeded relatively normally for about an hour. Then Brad stood up on one of the picnic benches, tapping a plastic fork against his red Solo cup to get everyone's attention. The backyard fell silent except for the sizzle of the grill. Brad is going completely off the rails now, making a Facebook group called Justice for Future Baby Names. I can't believe this. And he actually brought a binder full of old emails to Tim's mom's house to prove he mentioned the name years ago? WTF. Brad cleared his throat and announced he had prepared a statement. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and began reading about how family was built on respect and tradition, and how some people understood the sacred bonds of nomenclature while others callously disregarded them. It took everyone a minute to realize he was talking about baby names again. He continued his speech, explaining how he'd been building a relationship with the name Xander through meditation and visualization exercises. He described how he'd practiced writing it in different fonts, imagining calling it across playgrounds, and even sleep-talking it according to his roommate. Several cousins started edging toward the house. Tim stood up and suggested Brad might want to take a break and get some food. Brad ignored him, launching into a detailed explanation of how he'd already bought a domain name for XanderBrad.com and had plans for his future son's social media presence. He'd apparently also started a savings account under the name Xander's College Fund, even though he had no child and, as his lawyer friend had pointed out, was infertile. My grandmother finally had enough. She stood up, all 4 feet 11 inches of her, and told Brad to sit down and eat his hamburger before it got cold. The look she gave him could have frozen hellfire. Brad deflated slightly but didn't stop. He pulled out his phone to show everyone the Pinterest board he'd created for Xander's future nursery. That's when Emma's husband turned up the music really loud, drowning out the rest of Brad's presentation. People quickly dispersed to different areas of the yard. Brad followed various groups, trying to continue his speech over the blaring classic rock. I watched him corner our teenage cousins by the volleyball net, showing them something on his phone while they looked desperately for an escape route. Tim and I decided to leave early. As we gathered our things, Brad appeared at my elbow. He pressed a manila envelope into my hands before I could protest. Inside, he said, was a formal notice of name reservation he'd typed up himself, along with what he called supporting documentation for his claim. We left without opening it. At home, curiosity got the better of me. The envelope contained 23 pages of rambling text about Brad's connection to the name Xander, including a dream journal where he documented every dream featuring a child named Xander, a list of celebrities named Xander with notes about their achievements, and a bizarre family tree where he'd tried to prove that the name belonged to his branch of the family through some creative interpretation of naming patterns. The next few days brought more of the same. Brad created an Instagram account called The Real Baby Xander, where he posted ultrasound photos he'd found on Google Images with captions about his future son. He started a GoFundMe for Xander's Name Reclamation Legal Fund that raised exactly $0. He even commissioned a local artist to create a portrait of what he imagined his future son would look like, then carried the painting around in his car to show people. The painting incident marked a turning point. Brad's behavior shifted from merely annoying to genuinely concerning. He started showing up at my prenatal appointments, sitting in the waiting room with that commissioned portrait propped on the chair beside him. The receptionist would glance nervously between us while I filled out paperwork. Brad never approached me directly, just sat there holding the painting and staring. Tim began taking time off work to accompany me everywhere. His boss understood after Tim explained the situation, though I could see the disbelief in his eyes. Who would believe a grown man was stalking his pregnant cousin over a baby name? My mother called one afternoon while I was folding tiny onesies. She sounded shaken. Brad had shown up at her book club meeting, interrupting their discussion of this month's mystery novel to distribute pamphlets he'd created about the Xander legacy. He'd apparently spent hours at a print shop, creating professional-looking brochures complete with stock photos of babies and quotes he'd fabricated about the importance of name heritage. The book club ladies had politely accepted the pamphlets before asking him to leave. My mother found him later in the parking lot, approaching members as they left, pressing copies into their hands and explaining his cause. She'd had to call the building security to escort him away. That same week, Brad escalated his social media campaign. The Instagram account grew more elaborate. He started posting daily letters to future Xander, addressing the child he didn't have about the injustice of his stolen birthright. He tagged every family member in these posts, creating an uncomfortable digital paper trail of his obsession. My cousin Sarah called me crying. Brad had convinced her teenage daughter to give him access to the family group chat by claiming he'd been accidentally removed. He'd spent an entire night sending messages about name theft, uploading those genealogy charts, and creating polls about who had the stronger claim to the name. Sarah's daughter felt terrible about being manipulated. Tim's patience finally snapped when Brad showed up at his workplace. Tim worked at an accounting firm, a serious environment where Brad's dramatics stood out even more starkly. Brad had somehow talked his way past reception, claiming to be Tim's cousin with urgent family news. He'd cornered Tim in the break room during lunch, spreading documents across the table while Tim's coworkers watched in bewilderment. The documents were new. Brad had hired someone on a freelance website to create an entire fictional family history, supporting his claim to the name. There were forged letters from deceased relatives, photoshopped historical documents, and even a family crest he designed featuring the name Xander in elaborate script. Tim's boss had to to intervene when Brad refused to leave, insisting he needed just 5 more minutes to present his evidence. Security escorted Brad out while he clutched his fake documents. Tim came home that evening with a hollow look in his eyes. His coworkers had been understanding, but he could see the way they looked at him now, wondering what kind of family drama he'd brought into their professional space. Emma called the next morning with a warning. Brad had been reaching out to extended family members we barely knew, distant cousins and great aunts who lived in other states. He'd created a detailed presentation about our betrayal and was scheduling video calls to share his story. Some of these relatives, who hadn't seen us in years, were actually buying into his narrative. One great aunt from Wisconsin sent me a stern email about respecting family traditions and considering Brad's feelings. She'd never met Brad, had maybe seen him once at a funeral 15 years ago, but his presentation had been compelling enough to convince her I was being selfish. More emails followed from relatives I'd forgotten existed, all parroting Brad's talking points about legacy and birthright. The situation reached new heights of absurdity when Brad hired a genealogist, not to trace our actual family history, but to find any historical Xanders in our lineage he could claim connection to. The genealogist, unaware of the situation, did professional work and found exactly what you'd expect. Nothing connecting Brad to the name Xander in any meaningful way. Undeterred, Brad interpreted the lack of evidence as proof of a cover-up. He started a blog called The Xander Conspiracy, where he posted increasingly unhinged theories about why the genealogist couldn't find connections. He suggested our grandmother had hidden documents, that there was a family secret about a Xander who'd been written out of history, that I somehow knew about this and was deliberately stealing what was rightfully his. My baby shower gifts started disappearing from our porch. Packages would show delivered, but by the time we got home, they were gone. We installed a doorbell camera and caught Brad on video, not stealing the packages, but photographing them. He was documenting every gift, every card, every gesture of support for our illegitimate claim to the name. Tim wanted to confront him, but I was 8 months pregnant and exhausted. The stress was affecting my health. My doctor noticed my blood pressure creeping up and recommended reducing stressors. How could I explain that my cousin had turned my pregnancy into his personal crusade? Patricia organized an intervention. She invited Brad to lunch under the pretense of hearing his side of the story. Instead, he arrived to find several family members waiting, ready to talk sense into him. The intervention lasted exactly 12 minutes before Brad stormed out, but not before delivering a speech about how they'd all been compromised by my manipulation. He started showing up at family members' workplaces, always with new evidence or arguments. He'd refined his approach, no longer ranting, but presenting himself as a concerned family member trying to preserve tradition. He'd learned which arguments worked on which relatives, tailoring his presentations to their specific values and concerns. My uncle, who'd initially found the situation amusing, called me apologizing. Brad had shown up at his daughter's college graduation party, turning what should have been a celebration into another platform for his cause. He'd brought the painting, the documents, and a new edition, a scrapbook of every time he'd mentioned the name Xander over the past 5 years, highlighted and annotated. The scrapbook was disturbing in its thoroughness. Text messages where he'd mentioned the name in passing, screenshots of social media posts, even photos of birthday cards where he'd signed future dad to Xander. The effort involved in creating it must have taken weeks. My uncle had to physically remove the scrapbook from Brad's hands to get him to leave the party. Tim's sister started screening her calls. Brad had taken to calling her during her daughter's soccer practices, timing it so she'd be a captive audience on the sidelines. He developed a rotating schedule of which family members to contact on which days, ensuring everyone got their regular dose of his campaign. The breaking point came during my cousin's wedding. Not Emma's, but another cousin, Margaret, who tried to stay neutral in the whole situation. She'd specifically asked Brad not to bring up the name issue at her wedding. She'd even seated us at opposite ends of the reception hall. Brad behaved during the ceremony, sitting quietly in his pew. But during the reception, after a few drinks, he commandeered the microphone during the open toast portion. What started as congratulations to the bride and groom quickly devolved into a speech about family loyalty and the importance of honoring commitments to future generations. The DJ tried to cut the music back on, but Brad had unplugged the microphone from the system, making it portable. He walked between tables, addressing different family members by name, asking them to consider what kind of family they wanted to be part of, one that honored spiritual claims or one that allowed theft within its ranks. Margaret's new husband's family watched in bewilderment as Brad pulled out his phone to show a PowerPoint presentation he'd prepared just in case the topic came up. The bride was in tears. The groom's family whispered among themselves, clearly reconsidering what they'd married into. Tim and several other cousins managed to corner Brad and get the microphone away, but the damage was done. Oh wow, Brad made a scrapbook with every single time he mentioned the name Xander. Can you believe he spent weeks highlighting text messages and birthday cards like some kind of detective? And then he crashed Margaret's wedding with a portable microphone and started walking around between the tables giving speeches to everyone. The poor bride was crying and the groom's family must have been thinking, what did we just marry into? I can't believe he actually brought a PowerPoint presentation to a wedding just in case the topic came up. Margaret's wedding video would forever include Brad's manifesto about name theft. The photographer had captured it all. Brad gesturing wildly, the bride crying, family members with their heads in their hands. We left early, driving home in silence. I was 2 weeks from my due date and couldn't handle any more stress. Tim held my hand at every red light, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. Something had shifted in him during that wedding scene. The next morning, Brad posted the video of his wedding speech on every social media platform. He'd filmed it himself on his phone, proud of what he called his most important presentation yet. The comments from non-family members were brutal, calling him out for ruining a wedding over his obsession. But Brad interpreted the negative comments as evidence that the conspiracy against him went beyond family. He started a podcast called The Name Game: A Family Betrayal, where he discussed his situation in exhausting detail. Only 3 episodes were released before the hosting platform removed it for harassment, but Brad had already moved on to other venues. He created TikTok videos, YouTube shorts, even a failed Kickstarter to fund a documentary about name theft in modern families. Each platform brought new opportunities to share his story, to find sympathetic ears who didn't know the full context. He became skilled at presenting himself as a victim, editing conversations and interactions to support his narrative. My water broke 3 days after Margaret's wedding. Tim rushed me to the hospital while fielding calls from family members warning us that Brad had posted about sensing a disturbance in the spiritual realm and was on his way to the hospital. We had to alert hospital security about the situation, showing them photos of Brad and explaining why he couldn't be allowed in the maternity ward. Labor lasted 14 hours. During that time, Brad live tweeted from the hospital waiting room about being excluded from his spiritual son's birth. He'd brought the painting again, propping it up on waiting room chairs and taking selfies with it. Security eventually asked him to leave when other patients complained about his behavior. Tim stayed by my side throughout, but I could see him checking his phone, watching Brad's social media meltdown in real time. Family members sent screenshots of Brad's posts, each more unhinged than the last. He'd started a countdown to the theft being complete, treating our son's birth like some kind of cosmic deadline. When our son was finally born, healthy and perfect, the first thing I felt was relief that the pregnancy drama was over. The second thing I felt was dread about what Brad would do next. Tim held our son, tears streaming down his face, and promised to protect us both from whatever came next. We named him Xander, of course. The birth announcement was simple, shared only with close family through private messages. We knew Brad would find out eventually, but we wanted a few hours of peace with our new son. Those hours were precious. Just the three of us in the hospital room. Finally, a complete family. Brad's reaction came faster than expected. Within 2 hours of the birth announcement reaching the family grapevine, he'd created a website, Justice for the Real Xander. The homepage featured the commissioned painting alongside a manifesto about spiritual theft and family betrayal. He'd purchased multiple domain names, all variations of Xander-related URLs, trying to corner the digital market on our son's name. My grandmother called while I was trying to breastfeed for the first time. She'd had enough. At 91 years old, she commanded respect in our family that transcended Brad's manipulation. She decided to take action, but wouldn't tell me what she planned. She just said to focus on my baby and let her handle Brad. The hospital discharged us after 2 days. Tim had arranged for his brother to check our house before we arrived, making sure Brad wasn't waiting. The nursery we'd so carefully prepared felt different now, like a sanctuary we'd had to defend. Every decision about our son's name had been shadowed by Brad's obsession. Our first night home, Brad projection mapped messages onto our house. He'd rented professional equipment and parked down the street, displaying rotating messages about justice and theft onto our garage door. The real Xander deserves better scrolled across our home in 3-foot letters. Neighbors came out to watch the spectacle. Tim called the police, but Brad was technically on public property and wasn't making noise. The officers seemed baffled by the situation, taking notes about projection mapping and name theft while trying to keep straight faces. They suggested we document everything for a potential restraining order, though they admitted they'd never seen anything quite like this. The projection mapping continued for 3 hours until the equipment rental period ended. Brad packed up and left, but not before ensuring every neighbor had seen his display. Our elderly neighbor brought us cookies the next day, patting my hand sympathetically and mentioning how family can be complicated. Sarah organized a protective rotation. Family members who still supported us took turns visiting, creating a buffer between us and Brad. They'd intercept him in the driveway, redirect him when he showed up, and monitor his social media for escalation signs. It was exhausting for everyone, but they insisted on helping. During one of Sarah's shifts, Brad arrived with a mobile notary and what he called official documentation for me to sign. The documents were nonsense, a hodgepodge of legal-sounding language about relinquishing claims to the name Xander. The notary, once they understood the situation, refused to notarize anything and left quickly. Brad's next move was more creative. He started a scholarship fund in the name of the real Xander, accepting donations for a child who didn't exist. The few dollars that trickled in from confused distant relatives were returned when payment processors realized the fraudulent nature of the fund, but Brad screenshot the donation page before it was removed, using it as evidence of public support. My milk supply suffered from the stress. The pediatrician assured me it was normal given the circumstances, but I felt like I was failing my son already. Tim took over night feeding so I could sleep, but even in my dreams, I heard Brad's voice talking about spiritual connections and stolen legacies. Patricia discovered Brad had been visiting psychics, trying to get them to confirm his spiritual connection to the name. He'd gone to over a dozen in the tri-state area, recording sessions where he led them toward the answers he wanted. Most saw through him immediately, but he edited together clips from the few who played along, creating a video called Psychic Proof, the Xander Connection. The family group chat, once Brad was removed, became a support network. Members shared Brad's sightings like storm warnings, alerting others when he was on the move. Brad spotted at Target buying poster board meant someone's house was about to get picketed. Brad at the library printing meant new documents were coming. Tim's breaking point came when Brad started contacting our pediatrician's office. He'd called pretending to be Tim, trying to get information about our son. The office staff, well trained in privacy laws, didn't fall for it, but the attempt shook us. Brad was trying to insert himself into our son's medical care. We switched pediatricians, driving an extra 20 minutes for appointments at a practice where Brad wouldn't think to look. Every decision now required strategic thinking. Which grocery store was Brad least likely to visit? Which park could we go to without running into him? Our world shrank to avoid his expanding campaign. Emma's husband, a generally peaceful man, finally confronted Brad at a gas station. Not violently, but firmly, telling him exactly what the family thought of his behavior. Brad filmed the entire interaction, later editing it to make himself look like the victim of an unprovoked attack. The video went viral in certain corners of the internet where people collected stories of family drama. My first Mother's Day arrived when Xander was 3 weeks old. Tim had planned a quiet celebration at home, but Brad had other ideas. He organized what he called a march for the real Xander, inviting anyone who supported his cause to walk from the park to our street. Only he and 2 confused strangers showed up, but he live-streamed it as if it were a major protest. The march ended at our property line, where Brad planted a sign reading, "Home of the Stolen Name." Tim removed it immediately, but Brad had already posted photos online. The image spread through family social media, becoming a meme among younger cousins who'd started treating the whole situation as dark comedy. Grandmother's land finally revealed itself during a family reunion we didn't attend. She'd gathered the entire extended family, including those distant relatives Brad had been recruiting, with the authority only a matriarch could command. She laid out the facts clearly and simply. Then she issued an ultimatum. Anyone who continued to enable Brad's behavior would be excluded from family events. The effect was immediate. The distant relatives who'd been sympathetic to Brad suddenly remembered they had their own lives to focus on. The emotional support he'd been receiving dried up. Even those who privately thought we should have chosen a different name recognized that Brad's behavior had crossed every line of acceptability. Brad responded by declaring himself estranged from the family. He posted a lengthy goodbye on social media, comparing himself to various historical figures who'd been persecuted for their beliefs. The post was deleted within hours, replaced by a new strategy. He would document everything for a future tell-all book about family betrayal. He started interviewing family members who talked to him, recording their memories of him mentioning the name Xander over the years. Most refused, but a few distant cousins, enjoying their moment of attention, gave dramatic interviews about sensing Brad's connection to the name. These interviews became part of his growing archive of evidence. Tim installed security cameras around our property after we caught Brad measuring our fence line. He'd been researching property laws, trying to find some loophole that would give him access to our home. The cameras caught him returning at odd hours, never doing anything illegal but always watching, always documenting. My maternity leave was ending, and the thought of leaving Xander at daycare terrified me. Not because of normal new parent anxiety, but because Brad had already called every daycare in the area, warning them about the complicated custody situation regarding a child named Xander. We had to provide documentation to prove Brad had no relation to our son beyond being a cousin. The daycare implemented extra security measures, requiring a password for pickup that we changed weekly. The staff was understanding but clearly overwhelmed by the situation. I spent my first day back at work anxiously checking the daycare's camera app, half expecting to see Brad pressed against the window. He'd evolved his tactics again. Instead of direct confrontation, he started what he called the Xander Archive, a comprehensive collection of every piece of evidence supporting his claim. He rented a storage unit specifically for this purpose, filling it with binders, posters, and that omnipresent painting. He gave virtual tours of the archive to anyone who'd watch. Tim's employer offered him a transfer to their Portland office. Yes, grandmother coming in with the ultimate power move at that family reunion. She gathered everyone together and basically said pick a side, Brad or the rest of the family, and people scattered like leaves. I can't believe Brad actually started measuring their fence line trying to find legal loopholes to get on their property. We'd never considered leaving our hometown, but the offer became increasingly attractive. The idea of starting fresh, somewhere Brad wouldn't follow, seemed like the only way to give Xander a normal childhood. We began quietly researching neighborhoods and schools 3,000 miles away. Patricia found out Brad had been attending grief counseling groups, presenting himself as a father mourning a child he'd never had. The counselors, trained to provide safe spaces, couldn't verify his story and had to take him at his word. He'd made friends in these groups, people who genuinely believed his pain was real, who validated his feelings of loss. When confronted about exploiting grief support groups, Brad doubled down. He insisted his pain was real, that the child he'd imagined and planned for had been stolen from him. The distinction between reality and his fantasy had blurred so completely that he genuinely believed his own narrative. Our son grew despite the chaos. His first smile, his first laugh, every milestone felt like a tiny victory against the storm Brad had created. We documented everything privately, afraid to share on social media where Brad would twist it into evidence of our guilt about stealing the name. The situation reached an unexpected crescendo when Brad announced he was planning to legally change his own name to Xander. He'd started the paperwork, paid the fees, and scheduled the court hearing. His logic was that if he became Xander Sr., it would establish his prior claim when he eventually had a son. This development divided the family further. Some saw it as the final proof of Brad's complete break from reality. Others worried about the psychological implications of him taking on the identity he'd been fighting for. Grandmother, ever practical, pointed out that him changing his name would actually solve the problem, as he could hardly complain about us using a name he himself had adopted. Brad created new social media accounts under the name Xander, practicing his new identity. He signed emails as Xander, introduced himself as Xander at coffee shops, and even had business cards printed with his new name. The transformation was unsettling to watch, like he was becoming the child he'd never have. As I prepared bottles for daycare, watching my son sleep peacefully in his crib, I realized something had shifted. Brad's behavior had become so extreme that it had lost its power over us. The family had united not in support of him, but in protection of us. Even Margaret, whose wedding he'd ruined, reached out to offer support and apologize for ever trying to stay neutral. Tim and I made a decision. We would attend the court hearing for Brad's name change, not to protest, but to support it. If Brad wanted to become Xander, we'd let him. Our son would grow up knowing his name was chosen with love, not stolen from anyone. The name belonged to him because we'd given it to him, and no amount of Brad's theatrics could change that fundamental truth. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and drizzly. Tim adjusted Xander's car seat while I packed the diaper bag, preparing for what felt like the final chapter of this bizarre saga. Whatever happened in that courtroom, we were ready to move forward. Our son deserved a life unburdened by his cousin's obsession, and we were prepared to fight for that future, whether in our hometown or 3,000 miles away in Portland. The courthouse parking lot was packed when we arrived. Tim circled 3 times before finding a spot near the back. I unbuckled Xander from his car seat while Tim grabbed the diaper bag, both of us moving with the practiced efficiency of new parents who'd learned to function on minimal sleep. Inside the courthouse, we found Brad already waiting outside the designated courtroom. He dressed for the occasion in what looked like a new suit, holding a leather portfolio that probably contained more evidence of his spiritual connection to the name. When he spotted us, his face cycled through several emotions before settling on something between triumph and confusion. Tim shifted Xander to his other arm as Brad approached. My cousin stopped a few feet away, clearly unsure how to interpret our presence. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again before finally gesturing toward the courtroom doors. We all filed in together, an awkward procession that drew curious looks from the court clerk. The hearing itself was surprisingly mundane. The judge, a tired-looking woman who'd probably seen every possible reason for name changes, reviewed Brad's paperwork with professional detachment. She asked the standard questions about criminal history and fraudulent intent. Brad answered each one earnestly, explaining his deep spiritual connection to the name without mentioning the family drama. When the judge asked if anyone present had objections, Tim and I remained silent. Brad kept glancing at us, clearly expecting us to speak up. The judge's gaze swept the room once more before she approved the petition. Just like that, Brad legally became Xander. Outside the courtroom, Brad clutched his name change decree like a trophy. He started to say something to us, but Xander chose that moment to spit up on Tim's shoulder. We busied ourselves with cleanup while Brad stood there, seemingly at a loss for what came next. Eventually, he walked away, still holding his papers. The next few weeks passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes. Brad, now legally Xander, seemed temporarily satisfied with his victory. The family group chat reported fewer sightings, though Patricia mentioned he'd updated all his social media profiles and was insisting everyone use his new name. Then came the christening invitation. Tim's parents wanted to host a small ceremony for the baby at their church. We'd been hesitant about any family gatherings, but they assured us it would be intimate, just immediate family. They'd specifically not invited Brad, though we all knew that had never stopped him before. The morning of the christening, I dressed our son in the tiny white outfit my mother had saved from my own baptism. Tim loaded the car with the precision of someone preparing for multiple contingencies, extra diapers, backup outfits, and a cooler with bottles just in case. We'd learned to over-prepare for everything. The church was quiet when we arrived. Tim's parents had decorated simply, with white flowers at the altar and programs printed with our son's full name, Xander Timothy. My parents were already there, along with Tim's sister and a handful of close relatives. No Brad in sight. The ceremony began smoothly. The minister spoke about the significance of names, how they carried hopes and dreams for a child's future. I caught Tim's eye during this part, both of us thinking the same thing. If only the minister knew how significant this particular name had become. Halfway through the ceremony, the church doors creaked open. Everyone turned to see Brad standing in the entrance, wearing what appeared to be the same suit from his name change hearing. He didn't make a scene, just slipped into a back pew. The minister continued without pause, though I noticed Tim's mother's jaw tighten. When it came time for the actual christening, the minister asked us to bring Xander forward. As we walked up the aisle, I could feel Brad's eyes following us. The minister took our son gently, cradling him with practiced ease. She spoke his name clearly as she performed the ritual, each syllable ringing through the small church. After the ceremony, we gathered in the church basement for cake and coffee. Brad had disappeared during the final blessing, leaving only a card on the pew where he'd been sitting. Tim's mother handed it to us with a grimace. Inside, Brad had written simply, "From one Xander to another." The following Monday, I returned to work to find a package on my desk. No return address, but I recognized Brad's handwriting. Inside was a silver picture frame containing a photo I'd never seen before. It showed Brad as a child, maybe 5 years old, wearing a t-shirt with Xander written across it in marker. A sticky note attached read, "Proof I loved the name first." I showed Tim the photo that evening. We studied it together, noting how Brad had clearly written the name himself, the letters backwards and uneven as children's writing often is. Tim suggested we keep it, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder of how far Brad's obsession had traveled. Sarah called the next day with news. Brad had started introducing himself at coffee shops and stores as Xander Sr., despite having no children. He'd ordered new business cards with his title and was telling anyone who'd listen about his son who shared his name. The barista at his regular cafe had asked Sarah if Brad was okay, concerned about his increasingly elaborate stories. We decided to test the waters with a family gathering. Emma was hosting a 4th of July barbecue and assured us she'd manage Brad if he showed up. We arrived to find most of the family already there, kids running running through sprinklers while adults nursed beers in the shade. Normal, peaceful, everything we'd missed during the months of drama. Brad arrived an hour later, and something was different. He moved through the party with an odd calmness, introducing himself as Xander to relatives who knew exactly who he was. He didn't approach us directly, didn't mention the baby, didn't pull out any documents or phones. He just existed in the space, occasionally glancing our way but maintaining distance. Patricia pulled me aside near the dessert table. She'd been talking to Brad's roommate, who reported that Brad had redecorated his entire apartment with the name Xander. Monogrammed towels, custom artwork, even a doormat. He'd fully embraced his new identity, living as the Xander he'd insisted he was meant to be. As the sun set, I found myself watching Brad from across the yard. He was sitting alone at a picnic table, nursing a beer and staring at nothing in particular. For the first time since this all began, he looked almost peaceful. Not happy exactly, but no longer vibrating with the manic energy that had driven his campaign. Tim appeared at my elbow with Xander, who was fussing for his evening feeding. As I took our son, Brad looked up and our eyes met across the yard. He raised his beer slightly, not quite a toast, but an acknowledgement. I nodded back and that was it. No confrontation, no drama, just two people named Xander existing in the same space. The drive home was quiet, except for the baby's contented gurgling. Tim reached over to squeeze my hand at a red light. We'd survived the storm, weathered Brad's obsession, and come out the other side with our family intact. Our son would grow up with his name, chosen with love, regardless of whatever claim Brad felt he had. Over the following weeks, reports from family members suggested Brad was settling into his new identity. He'd stopped creating new evidence, stopped trying to recruit allies, stopped showing up at inappropriate times. He was just Xander now, living his life as the person he'd insisted he was meant to be. The Portland job offer still sat on our kitchen table, neither accepted nor rejected. Tim and I discussed it during late-night feedings, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of a fresh start was appealing, but something had shifted. Brad's behavior, while still odd, no longer felt threatening. He'd found his own way to have the name, and it seemed to have satisfied whatever deep need had driven his obsession. My grandmother called one evening while I was giving Xander a bath. She'd run into Brad at the grocery store, where he'd politely helped her load groceries into her car. He'd introduced himself as Xander, and she'd played along, treating him like this had always been his name. Oh my goodness. Brad showed up to the christening in the same suit from his court hearing. But wait, he just sat quietly in the back and then left a card saying, "From one Xander to another." That's actually kind of sweet in a weird way. And then that photo of little Brad with Xander written backwards on his shirt is just heartbreaking and hilarious at the same time. She said he'd seemed calmer than she'd seen him in years. We decided to stay. Portland would always be an option, but running no longer felt necessary. Our son would grow up surrounded by family, even if that family included a cousin who'd legally changed his name to match his. It was strange, certainly, but families were built on strangeness sometimes. The daycare password system remained in place, more out of habit than fear. Brad had never attempted to visit since his name change. The staff occasionally asked if we still needed the extra security, but we kept it. Some precautions were worth maintaining, even if the threat had passed. Tim's work held their annual family picnic in August. We debated attending, knowing Brad might be there through some peripheral connection. In the end, we went. Xander needed to meet Tim's coworkers, and we couldn't hide forever. The picnic passed without incident, though one coworker did mention meeting Tim's brother Xander at a coffee shop, clearly confused by the family resemblance and shared name. As summer turned to fall, a new normal emerged. Brad lived his life as Xander. We raised our son Xander, and the family adapted to having two Xanders at gatherings. The younger cousins found it hilarious, creating nicknames to distinguish them. Big Xander and Baby Xander became the standard, though Brad preferred Original Xander when he could get away with it. Margaret sent a thank you card for a baby gift, mentioning she was pregnant. Inside, she'd written a postscript. "Don't worry, we're going with Jennifer. No drama guaranteed." It was the first time anyone had directly joked about the situation, and it felt like a turning point. The family was healing, learning to laugh about what had once torn us apart. I returned from maternity leave to find my coworkers curious but polite about the family situation they'd heard whispers about. I gave them the abbreviated version. Cousin really wanted the name. We used it anyway. He legally changed his own name. Everyone moved on. They seemed disappointed by the anticlimactic ending, expecting something more dramatic. But that was the thing about real life. Sometimes the most dramatic conflicts resolved not with grand gestures or final confrontations, but with quiet acceptance and time. Brad had gotten what he wanted, in a way. He was Xander. We had our Xander. The family had two Xanders. It wasn't the resolution anyone had expected, but it worked. Our son grew steadily, hitting each milestone with the blissful ignorance of a child unaware of the drama his name had caused. He smiled, rolled over, began reaching for toys, normal baby things that felt like small miracles after everything we'd been through. Each developmental leap was documented in private photos, shared only with trusted family members who wouldn't forward them to Brad. Though as time passed, even that precaution seemed unnecessary. Brad had shifted his focus entirely to living as Xander. He'd started dating someone new, introducing himself with his legal name from the start. The relationship seemed to ground him, giving him something to focus on besides his imagined connection to our son. Tim and I settled into parenthood with the usual mix of exhaustion and joy. We found our rhythm, developed our routines, learned to function as a family unit. The name that had once caused so much conflict became just our son's name, spoken dozens of times daily without any weight beyond love and recognition. One evening, as I rocked Xander to sleep, I realized I'd gone a full day without thinking about Brad, then a week, then longer. The obsession that had consumed our pregnancy had faded into background noise, just another odd family story to someday share at gatherings. Remember when Brad changed his name? Would join the canon of family lore, stripped of its power to hurt. We kept the photos Brad had sent, the documents he'd created, the evidence of his campaign, not as trophies or reminders of conflict, but as artifacts of a strange chapter in our family's history. Someday, when our son was older, we'd tell him the story, how his name had been chosen with love, defended with determination, and ultimately shared in the strangest possible way. The security cameras remained installed, the daycare password stayed in place, and we maintained a general awareness of Brad's presence in our lives. But these were precautions now, not active defenses, like keeping a fire extinguisher in the kitchen or knowing where the circuit breaker was, just in case but not expected to be needed. Family gatherings gradually returned to normal. Brad attended as Xander, we attended with Xander, and life moved forward. The initial awkwardness gave way to routine. Two Xanders at Christmas dinner became as normal as Aunt Marie's dry turkey or Uncle Pete's inappropriate jokes. Families adapted. That's what they did. As our son's first birthday approached, we planned a small celebration. Just family, nothing elaborate. When making the guest list, Tim and I exchanged a look. Brad would be invited, not because we'd forgiven everything, but because excluding him now would create more drama than including him. He was family, for better or worse. The invitation was sent, received, and accepted without fanfare. Brad, now fully established as Xander, RSVP'd like any other relative. He even asked what gift would be appropriate, showing a self-awareness that had been absent during his campaign. Progress came in small steps sometimes. The morning of the party, I dressed our son in a tiny button-up shirt with Xander embroidered on the pocket, a gift from Tim's mother. As I fastened each button, I thought about how different this day might have been. We could have been in Portland, celebrating with strangers. We could have chosen a different name, avoided the whole conflict, but we hadn't. We'd stood our ground, weathered the storm, and come out the other side. The party unfolded smoothly. Brad arrived on time, brought an age-appropriate appropriate gift, and maintained appropriate boundaries. He took photos from a distance, made small talk with relatives, and even helped clean up afterward. When he held Xander briefly for a family photo, there was no dramatic proclamation or spiritual connection claimed, just a man holding his cousin's baby at a birthday party. As guests departed, Brad lingered on the porch. He thanked us for including him, acknowledged the journey they'd all taken to reach this point. Then he left, driving away in the same car he'd once used to stake out our house. The same man, but different, changed by his own obsession and its resolution. That night, after Xander was asleep and the dishes were done, Tim and I sat on our couch surrounded by new toys and crumpled wrapping paper. We'd made it through our son's first year, through Brad's campaign, through the uncertainty and stress. Our family had bent but not broken. We'd protected our son while finding a way to coexist with Brad's new identity. The Portland job offer had long since expired, but we didn't regret staying. This was home, complicated family dynamics and all. Our son would grow up here, surrounded by people who'd rallied to protect him before he was even born. He'd learn that family meant standing together, even when one member went completely off the rails. In the end, Brad had been right about one thing. The name Xander was special. Special enough to drive a man to legal name change. Special enough to divide a family. Special enough to unite them again. But most importantly, special because we'd chosen it for our son, defended it against all challenges, and given it to him with love. As I checked on Xander one last time before bed, I whispered his name in the darkness. Not as a declaration or defense, but simply as recognition. This was who he was. Xander, our son. Named with intention, raised with love, and protected by a family that had learned just how far they'd go for one of their own. The drama was over. Life moved forward. And somewhere across town, another Xander was probably updating his social media profiles or practicing his signature. Two men with the same name, connected by blood and conflict, separated by sanity and time. It wasn't the ending anyone had predicted, but it was real, messy, and ultimately survivable. That's what family was, after all. Not perfect harmony, but managed chaos. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to move past it. We'd all learned that lesson the hard way. United in the strangest possible way by a name that meant defender of mankind. In the end, perhaps we'd all defended something. Brad his delusions, us our choices, the family their bonds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new milestones, new moments of joy and frustration. But tonight, our son slept peacefully in his crib, unaware of the battle fought over his name. He was simply Xander, perfect and loved, defended and cherished. And that was enough. What a perfect ending. Brad showing up like a totally normal person and just being a regular guest at the party is the best plot twist ever. He held baby Xander for a photo without any weird drama and even helped clean up. This is such amazing growth. And the parents staying in their home instead of running away shows how strong they are. I love how the story ends with both Xanders living their own lives in the same town, connected but separate.